September 22nd, 1944. Ede, Netherlands, 9:47 in the evening. The floorboards creak beneath her swollen feet as Anneke van der Meer lowers herself onto the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her belly where a child kicks and turns, oblivious to the chaos consuming the world outside. February 12th, 1943. The air tasted of ice and pine smoke, bitter in a way that made swallowing difficult. Up in the scattered village of Bagnères de Luchon, at the foot of the French Pyrenees, a young boy named Etienne Roussel stood outside a stone barn, watching the road below through the early morning fog. He was 11 years old, barefoot despite the cold, his toes already numb inside shoes worn down to almost nothing. His breath came in short clouds, visible and quick. Etienne's hands trembled, not from the cold alone, but from something deeper, the kind of fear that roots itself in the stomach and spreads upward until even blinking feels dangerous. Down the mountain road, he could hear the faint rumble of German trucks, their engines growling through the valley like wolves circling prey. And somewhere behind the crumbling barn where he stood, hidden beneath old hay and torn blankets, 8 people waited in silence. 2 mothers, 3 children, an elderly man with a cough he couldn't suppress, and 2 young men who had deserted from a forced labor camp near Toulouse. They had no papers, no weapons, no plan beyond the thin hope that a child who knew the mountains could lead them across the border into Spain. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Etienne had not been born into courage. Before the war swallowed his world, he had been an ordinary boy in an ordinary village, the youngest son of a shepherd who grazed flocks on the high meadows between France and Spain. His father, Marcel Roussel, had taught him the mountain passes the way other fathers taught their sons to read, as something necessary, something that might one day keep you alive. Etienne learned to navigate by the shape of ridgelines, by the way snow gathered in certain valleys, by the smell of wind before a storm. He learned which paths the sheep preferred in summer, which caves offered shelter when fog descended too quickly, and which slopes could kill you if the snow decided to move. His childhood had been simple. Mornings spent carrying water from the stream, afternoons helping his mother hang laundry on lines stretched between 2 apple trees, evenings listening to his father's stories about smugglers who used to cross these same mountains a century ago, carrying salt and wine and letters between lovers, separated by borders drawn on maps. Etienne had dreamed in the way children dream, of becoming a teacher, of seeing Paris one day, of owning a bicycle. He had never imagined that the mountains his father taught him to love would become corridors of desperation, or that his small, unremarkable knowledge would be the only thing standing between strangers and death. The war arrived slowly at first, like a sickness creeping through distant villages before reaching your own door. Etienne's older brother, Luc, was conscripted in 1940 and never returned. No letter, no confirmation, just silence that thickened with each passing month until it became its own kind of answer. Then came the soldiers, not French but German, their uniforms too clean, their voices too loud, their presence a violation of something Etienne couldn't name but felt in his bones. They set up checkpoints on the valley roads, turned the mayor's house into a command post, and began asking questions about who lived where, who had disappeared, who might be hiding something. Food became scarce. Flour, when you could find it, cost more than Etienne's father made in a month. His mother began boiling grass to make soup, adding a single potato if they were lucky, a handful of beans if a neighbor took pity. At night, Etienne lay awake listening to whispered conversations between his parents, words like rationing and deportation and resistance, drifting through the thin walls like ghosts. He watched his father's face grow thinner, the lines around his mother's eyes deepen, and felt inside himself the shifting of something that had no language, only weight. By the winter of 1943, the village had become something else, no longer a place of flocks and harvest festivals, but a place of secrets and fear. People disappeared. Some were taken away in trucks, others simply vanished during the night, leaving locked doors and cold pots on stoves. Neighbors stopped greeting each other openly, afraid that a wrong word, a look held too long, might bring unwanted attention. The priest stopped giving sermons about peace. The school closed. And in the mountains above the village, paths that had once been used only by shepherds and hunters now carried a different kind of traffic. Desperate people trying to reach the Spanish border, fleeing from arrest, deportation, death. Some made it. Many didn't. Etienne's father, Marcel, had helped a few in the early months, guiding them through the safer passes under cover of darkness. But as German patrols increased, he stopped. "It's too dangerous," he told his wife one night, not knowing that Etienne was listening from the dark corner of the kitchen. "If they catch us, it's not just me, it's you, it's the boy." But then came the night of February 11th. Etienne was in the barn helping his father mend a broken fence when a man appeared in the doorway. He was too thin, his clothes hanging on him like rags on a scarecrow, his eyes sunken and wild with the kind of panic that comes from weeks without proper sleep. His name was Paul, and he had been a teacher in Toulouse before being sent to a forced labor camp building roads for the Germans. He had escaped 3 days earlier with another man, and now he was here, begging Marcel for help. But it wasn't just for him. There were others, he said. A Jewish family hiding in a barn 5 kilometers away, 2 women whose husbands had been arrested, children without parents. They all needed to cross into Spain. They all needed a guide. Marcel shook his head. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "Not with my son here. Not now." But Paul didn't leave. He stood there, shivering in the cold, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "If they stay, they'll die. You know that." Etienne saw his father's face in that moment, saw the conflict there, the pain of choosing between survival and humanity. And before he could stop himself, before the fear in his own chest could harden him into silence, Etienne spoke. "I can take them." The words came out small but clear. Marcel turned, his eyes wide. "No, you're a child." But Etienne had already decided. "You taught me the paths, I know the passes, and they won't suspect a child." It wasn't true, not entirely. The Germans suspected everyone. But there was something in Etienne's voice, a quiet firmness that surprised even himself. Maybe it was the memory of Luc, who never came home. Maybe it was the hunger he saw in his mother's face every day. Maybe it was just that, somewhere inside him, something had broken and reformed into something harder, something capable of bearing weight. Marcel didn't say yes that night, but when morning came and Paul returned with the others, the 2 mothers, the 3 frightened children, the old man who could barely stand, the 2 deserters with eyes that had seen too much, Marcel looked at Etienne and nodded. "You take them as far as the Col de la Cour. From there they follow the southern trail to the border. You come back before nightfall. Understood?" Etienne nodded. He didn't tell his father he was afraid. Didn't say that his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the small pack his mother had filled with bread and cheese. He just nodded, and when the others began to follow him out of the village, up the narrow trail that led to the frozen heights, he didn't look back. The climb was brutal. The snow was deep, reaching to the knee in places, and the wind cut like broken glass. Etienne moved ahead, traveling by instinct and memory, following paths he had walked with his father dozens of times. But this was different. It wasn't sheep he was guiding, but people, and each of them carried their own burden of exhaustion, fear, and pain. The old man fell twice, his cough echoing across the empty slopes in a way that made Etienne's heart race. The children cried, their small hands red and cracked from the cold. One of the mothers, a woman named Simone, carried a baby wrapped in blankets, and every time the baby whimpered, she pressed her hand over its mouth, her eyes wild with terror that the sound might carry. They walked for hours. The sun rose, weak and pale behind the clouds, and then began to sink again. Etienne kept them moving, pushing them forward, even when his own legs screamed with pain, even when his toes were so numb he could barely feel the ground beneath them. He knew they couldn't stop, knew that somewhere below, German patrols were combing the valleys, looking for people exactly like these, and he knew that if they were caught, there would be no mercy, not for the fugitives, and not for the boy leading them. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Etienne heard it, a distant sound muffled by the snow but unmistakable. Voices, German voices. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, and raised his hand to signal the others to stop. They obeyed instantly, standing as still as statues in the snow, their faces pale with terror. Etienne forced himself to breathe, to think. The voices were coming from below, from the eastern valley. That meant the patrol was climbing, probably following the same paths the fugitives used. He looked around, searching for shelter, and saw it just 50 meters ahead, a small cave set into the rocky hillside. It wasn't large, but it might be enough. He waved for the others to follow, moving as silently as possible through the deep snow, and one by one they squeezed into the narrow darkness of the cave. They waited. Minutes stretched like hours. Simone's baby began to whimper again, and she pressed it against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she tried to muffle it. Etienne could hear the voices growing closer, louder now, accompanied by the sound of boots crushing snow. He pressed himself against the cold rock wall, barely daring to breathe, and prayed for a miracle he wasn't sure he believed in. The voices grew louder, louder, and then so close that Etienne could hear the creak of leather and the clink of metal. The soldiers passed, 3 of them, maybe 4, their grey uniforms stained with mud and snow. They walked right by the cave entrance without looking inside and continued up the trail. Etienne waited until the sounds had completely faded before allowing himself to breathe again. When he finally moved, his legs were so stiff he almost fell. He stepped out of the cave, checked the trail in both directions, and then waved for the others to follow. They moved like ghosts, silent and frightened, and Etienne led them higher, always higher, toward the Col de la Cour. When they finally reached the pass, the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow. From here Etienne could see Spain, the mountains descending in layers of grey and blue to the distant horizon. He turned to the fugitives and pointed to the southern path. "Follow that trail. It leads down. Keep walking until you see lights. Don't stop, no matter what." Paul the deserter gripped Etienne's shoulder with a trembling hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice broken. "How you saved our lives." Etienne didn't know what to say. He just nodded and watched as they began their descent, their bodies small and dark against the white vastness of the mountain. He stood there until they disappeared from sight. Then he turned and began the long walk home. His body was exhausted, his mind numb, but inside him was something new, something that felt like both shame and pride. He had done something most people would never do, had risked everything for strangers, and somehow he had survived. Etienne never spoke about that day, not to his friends, not to his mother, not even to his father, except in the briefest words. It was too secret, too dangerous, and as the war continued, he made that journey 5 more times, each time guiding different groups of fugitives through the mountains and back to safety. He never knew what happened to them afterward, never knew if they survived the war, if they found homes, if they remembered the boy who guided them through the snow. He only knew that he had done something that mattered, in a world where very little seemed to matter. After the war, Etienne didn't become a teacher, didn't see Paris, didn't buy a bicycle. He stayed in the village, taking over his father's flock. When Marcel grew too old to make the climb, he married, had children, grew old in the same house where he had been born. And for 60 years he kept silent about what he had done, not because he was ashamed, but because it seemed too small to mention. 8 people, maybe fewer. What was that compared to the millions who suffered, who died, who fought in battles whose names everyone knew? He was just a child who knew the mountain, nothing more. It was his grandson, a history student named Antoine, who finally uncovered the truth. In 2003, while researching war records in the Toulouse Library, Antoine found a letter written in 1946 by a man named Paul Montagne, the deserter Etienne had guided. In the letter, Paul described his escape through the Pyrenees, and at the center of it was the figure of a boy. He was no more than 11 or 12 years old, Paul wrote, but he led us through the snow as if he had lived 100 lives. Without him, we would have died on that mountain. I owe him my life, and I never knew his name. Antoine confronted his grandfather with the letter. Etienne, now 71, read it in silence, his hands shaking. Then he looked up at his grandson and said simply, "It was a long time ago." But Antoine wouldn't let it go. Over the following months, he tracked down more documents, more letters, and discovered that of the 8 people Etienne had guided that February day, 6 had survived the war. Simone, the mother with the baby, had made a life in Argentina. Paul had become a journalist in Paris. The children had grown up, had families of their own, lived long and full lives, and none of them had forgotten the mountain boy. Etienne's story never appeared in history books, will never be taught in schools or commemorated in memorials, but for the 6 people he saved and for the dozens of children and grandchildren who exist because of his courage, his story is everything. It's a reminder that war isn't just about generals and battles, but about ordinary people facing impossible choices. It's a reminder that courage has nothing to do with weapons or uniforms, but with the willingness to risk everything for strangers you'll never see again. Etienne Roussel died in 2007 at 75. He was buried in the small cemetery above Bagnères de Luchon, overlooking the mountains he knew so well. There were no headlines, no public ceremony, just his family and a few villagers who remembered him as the quiet shepherd who rarely spoke about the past. But at his funeral, among the few people who attended, was an elderly woman who had traveled from Argentina and an elderly man who had come from Paris. They didn't speak much. They just stood there in the snow, looking at the grave. and wept for a boy they never had the chance to thank properly. In the end, maybe that's what it's all about. Not about heroes whose names everyone knows, but about the forgotten ones. The children, the farmers, the mothers and grandmothers, and ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world fell apart around them. They didn't ask for recognition, didn't expect gratitude. They just did what they thought was right in the moment that mattered, and then went back to their lives and never spoke of it again. And maybe in that silence, in that quietness, there exists a courage greater than any medal could capture. The courage to act without needing to be seen, to save lives without needing to be remembered, to be human in a time when humanity was the hardest thing to be.